Hello everyone, I'm Samantha Jane Smith.
And I'm Jacob Caines, and you are listening to the Classical Queer Podcast.
Right, hello everyone and welcome to the Classical Queer Podcast. Today I have a special show for you. Over the past few years I've interviewed many brilliant musicians, composers and others in the classical music world. However, I realised that the one person I haven't had an in-depth discussion with was my co-host, conductor, musicologist and performer based in Halifax, Nova Scotia, Jacob Caines. So I thought it would be great to interview him, and amazingly he agreed. So welcome to the Classical Queer Podcast as a guest, Jacob.
I'm so thrilled to be here. It feels both very much the exact same, but also kind of fun and exciting and new. So this is great.
Well, as you know, we always start off by asking our guests to talk about themselves and say something with a little bit of background in whatever way they wish. So over to you.
Yeah, so I usually say I'm a conductor and a musicologist. Primarily, that's what I do. So I teach at Dalhousie University here in Halifax University, but I teach here as a conductor and a musicologist, which is kind of my formal training. I did undergrad in conducting and a master's in musicology, but increasingly more and more, which is kind of one of the fun offshoots of this podcast, or where the podcast has come from, is an offshoot of this. My research is in queer performance and city-inspired queer performance and how queer communities within urban centers create art and work through artistic process and how they interact with each other and how queer performers build network across cities and across different spaces. And so the podcast is a good example of how queer musicians are increasingly, queer people in general, but queer musicians are increasingly less and less defined by boundaries and borders and communities and cities. And we're building networks across all sorts of different mediums. And so one way is by talking with people online. But a lot of the time I talk about where queer music goes. And so in my research, I talk a lot about where someone's queer music gets performed by non-queer people, by queer people, in a queer context, but in a straight space, all the kind of different things. And so that's where my doctoral research is. And so I work through that material at a university in Quebec called Concordia. But generally speaking, yeah, I like to say conductor musicologist, but kind of more and more other things.
I'm not going to ask you to go through all your PhD work in this podcast, but I mean, when you started this, you must have had your PhD. This must have had some idea of kind of what to expect. Has anything come out which has really surprised you?
I mean, I wouldn't say surprised, because that maybe makes it sound like I didn't do enough background work beforehand. but I think I was expecting to focus much more on kind of closed communities, and so closed networks of musicians living in one space, or things like the Queer Urban Orchestra in New York. I was kind of thinking of them as a self-contained thing, that I would research a group of people who lived in a place and who did one thing, and that would be kind of a case study. And the further I get into this, the more I realize that is maybe true, but is mostly a fallacy, that it's a much broader and much more pieced out network of people across many, many different places and times. I mean, there's so much to talk about with music from different eras being played by current contemporary artists and people who are writing things now that get played in different cities, and people who travel as musicians and people who exist only online as musicians. I think that's been the surprising thing in my research, is that it isn't nearly as geolocated as I thought it would be. I think there's a increasingly like diffuse idea of like a neighborhood, that these things are less and less reality. Whether that's good or not is like its own thing. I think we all kind of miss neighborhoods, but musically, I think it's also true that like there are more and more ways that queer people are connecting and making music online in different ways. And I don't think I was expecting that. I think I was expecting it to be much more, contained.
I know that in a lot of music making that I've seen is that there's a lot of a huge increase recently in online collaborations. Where people share their music or share parts of music or stems of music, and then they add to them and do this kind of thing. So I guess this is the kind of thing which is really taken off, maybe even in the last 3 or 4 years, maybe.
Yeah, I mean, certainly in the past 3 or 4 years, it's increased. I mean, we started the podcast 2 and a bit years ago, which is certainly part and parcel of that too. Like, we don't live in the same country, even, let alone same city. And most of the people that we talk with were never in the same place as them either. And so even though we're not creating necessarily together, we're adding to that discourse of queer music making. But I think we've only done, 3 where I've been in the same place with somebody at the same time. And so it just kind of proves that there's more and more ways that we can interact and do interact. And it actually feels quite natural. It feels not that strange to talk to somebody in Manchester and then Sydney, Australia, and then Quebec. Like it really actually feels quite normal.
Do you think this has affected the music itself? I mean, do you think that this kind of difference between having, as you say, a neighborhood where people actually got together, and now having this more diverse, diffuse environment has actually changed the music we're hearing?
I think so. I mean, I think, and it's not queer specific. I think it's changing music and everything across the board. But I think if I think of like a conservatory system, there's a really long held idea that, a composition class, let's say, who takes lessons for 4 years with one composition prof, they all kind of sound the same. And they all have kind of a similar vocabulary that they're drawing on. So like, Corigliano at Juilliard, like super famous pedagogue and composition teacher. And all of his students are phenomenal, but you can kind of tell that they're his students. That's not necessarily a bad thing. But more and more, I think that we're blurring the lines around that. And so you might have a teacher and you might be able to like draw out certain vocabulary from them, but you're also having conversations with somebody in Australia and Vienna and Vancouver and South America. And so somebody in Sao Paulo is telling you, oh, when I write music, I do this. And like, I try and create these types of sounds. And so somebody in London is recreating that, whether or not their teacher told them to, or whether or not it's what they're listening to. It may not even be being performed in that city by an orchestra, but you can hear it somewhere else and you can talk with that composer. And I think there's a difference between, it probably in the past, let's say 50 to 60 years, you could listen to music from around the world. That's not terribly groundbreaking, but you had to go find it yourself, or it had to be given to you, or you just encountered it, but you also didn't get to have a discussion with it. Like you got to listen to it and maybe emulate it, but you certainly weren't talking to the composer. You weren't talking to them in real time. You didn't get to interact with them. But, now you can hop on a Zoom call and like talk with the composer and they're going to chat with you about their music. And I think it is changing everything.
Yeah. I mean, I remember in a couple of the podcasts, we've talked to people who've also, taught to other groups outside the classical genre, and they fed things in. I think it was Florence Anamordes was talking about dubstep or something, and then there was other people bringing other things in. And I guess this is another thing as well. It's enabled sounds to come, not just from the classical world, but other worlds into our music.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, and I mean, Florida's a good example of that. And there's so many people that draw on a whole bunch of sounds that normally in quote unquote classical music we wouldn't draw on. There's so much more influence from the outside, which I think is a huge positive. I mean, other people would disagree, but I think it's great.
Yeah, I was actually, when you sent me some music over to listen to, one of the things you sent me had some extra bits on the end, and one of them was from a student thing, and there was a nice bit in there with the student ripping up newspaper and stomping around the stage and this kind of thing. And I think that was brilliant, taking in these extra sounds, just sounds of the environment into the music. It is kind of so fascinating. And it's great that the young people are taking this in, I think.
I do too. I mean, I like, as a pedagogue, like as a conductor, I think it's really important for students to experiment with all versions of sound. I think that's really crucial, whether or not they enjoy it or like it, or if they find it silly, or if they find it kind of pedantic or whatever. And they do. Like sometimes they find it all of those things. I mean, sometimes they love it. That's not to say they don't enjoy making weird sounds, but I think it's really important to remind them that all intentional sounds are music. And so if you're choosing to make that sound, that's part of our music lexicon. And so you may not like it, or you may, not want to sit down and listen to an hour of someone ripping music and like ripping paper and stomping, but like it is part of that creative process. And, from my queer researcher brain, that is queering of music. Like that is taking the normative and removing expectation and making something queered on stage. Sexuality aside, like that queering of expectation, that queering of what am I going to see in a concert hall? What sounds am I going to hear? How is the ensemble going to interact with the audience? To me, that's super important. I think having expectations be challenged is really good. I think seeing and hearing things on stage that you don't normally hear is really good. I think it's healthy. I think it's how we explore. I think it's how we get new sounds. But I also think it's kind of silly and fun.
Yeah, I mean, I kind of, when you start listening to these pieces, there's always something I think you can take from every single little piece, even if it's, as you say, music you don't like or sounds you don't like or whatever. But there's something in there. There's always something that's fascinating, even if it's something you dislike, I guess. I mean,
oh yeah.
I kind of so that's what you do, PhD. Let's talk a bit about your conducting, because that's the other major part of what you do. Spend most of your time on.
Yeah.
Tell us about who you're conducting for at the moment and the various groups that you're working.
So I do conducting with the Dalhousie Wind Ensemble. So that's my kind of main university job, and so they're an undergraduate group. Sometimes we have community members, but generally speaking, they're undergrads who are studying classical music. And then I'm kind of just a conductor for hire for kind of whatever happens. So sometimes it's community groups. I do a lot of clinicking, master classes, wandering around to high schools and different youth orchestras and things, and conducting them for an afternoon or a couple days. Sometimes it's pro groups with just kind of ad hoc ensembles, and occasionally I'll conduct with Alkali, who we're listening to a fair amount today, but mostly I'm a clarinetist with them, but sometimes I'll conduct them. But they're a group of professional musicians who all live in Halifax. But yeah, most of my conducting it's kind of funny. It's pretty straight-laced in terms of who I work with and most of the music that I get to conduct. But what I tend to try and do is take what is pretty normal music and make it much more interesting by presentation or
Hmm.
how it's paired with something, or maybe it's staged with something, or maybe I'm a really big believer in interdisciplinary arts. So most of what I conduct will have a theatrical element or a lighting element or a projection element, or uh, there's a spatial element where we move around a space, or it's
Mm.
interspersed with poetry, or there's a film element. We kind of do it all.
That's kind of interesting because do you find that um, your students, when they start, find that a difficult thing to understand? I mean, I can imagine that these people want to come and they want to be orchestral player, and now we've got film and theatre involved in it.
Oh yeah, there's always a it's funny. I see them for 4 years at a time, the university students, and so the first years are always very skeptical. Second years are semi-skeptical, but third and fourth years kind of know the deal and they're on board. But it takes them a couple years. I mean, we've done in the past couple years because of the pandemic, we've had to kind of scale back, but we've done some weird shows uh, where they really had to suspend what they were expecting to do in a wind ensemble. I mean, we had a show 5 years ago, 6 years ago, where we were in concurrently in different rooms of an old Victorian house,
Mm.
and the audience wandered through the house and listened to us play in different rooms at the same time. But it was paired with a synchronized light show. So there was
Oh.
one light designer who was standing kind of in the center of the house, controlling
Mm.
all of these different rooms. And so you would listen to us play with a light show, and then if the light show would switch, our music would switch as you wandered through rooms. And then we'd be poets in different rooms, and it was lovely, but it was very much not a traditional wind ensemble concert.
Yeah, but that sounds kind of fun. I remember, wasn't it? Somebody was telling us about what was it the walking around the rooms actually with the orchestra. Do you remember that? Somebody we had a guest on who was going around, and they had the music was on the walls, and in it,
Oh,
and
right.
they were wandering around the room with it. I kind of like this idea of
Mm,
of a different environment and different rooms for different things. It kind of it's a bit like having art, an art picture in a different room, and you feel
yeah.
differently. So having the music in a different room makes you feel different, I think.
Yeah, it was a lot of fun, but it does require a lot more of the students. I think the students expect to kind of do that traditional orchestral thing of like sit down, the music's on the stand, there's a stand light, the lights go down, you play your part, you get up, you bow and leave. My ethos is those um, that method of music making is really rare now. It does exist. I mean, there are orchestras that do that for sure, but the number of students who are ever going to get a job like that is so few.
Mm.
Not to say they're not talented, not to say they're not good. It's just there are very few of those jobs. And so we're kind of doing a disservice as educators to tell them that
Mm.
to train them in the way that that is what they're going to do, because they're probably not. 1 in 100 might.
Mm.
Um, in reality, they're going to play for the pit band of some musical, and then they're going to do some new music, and they're going to play like a jazz gig outside at a gazebo, and then they're going to teach some lessons, and then they're going to, play piano for a dance class. Like that's much more the realistic route for musicians, at least in North America. And so I try and give them a much more real
Mm.
experience.
I think that's an interesting approach because I think, I mean, as you know, I'm a physicist by training. And one of the things that there's always a criticism of physicists is that when they teach, they're teaching that top 1% that are going on to be, famous physicists and this
Mm,
kind of thing, and not the rest that aren't going to be that, but are still,
mm.
require some education. And so it's important to give this broader perspective, I think. And that sounds kind of great, really, to do that.
Yeah, and maybe it's because we're in music and we can do that. I don't know what that would look like at training physicists. Like, I don't know if there's a way to do the kind of more practical on the ground
Oh, we love
work.
explosions. So
Yeah, exactly. Exactly. Maybe that's what you need to switch to a little
Maybe that's
more
what
of.
you need to do. Yeah, yeah. Interesting. Well, let's. I think it's time we listen to a piece of music. Now, the music we're going to hear, at least the first couple of pieces, with your alkali group, and I think the first one is called "Explosions" by Holly Winter. And you were both playing in this, and you were conducting, if I remember correctly. Is that right, or just playing?
Just playing. So this is a piece called "Nothing to Do with Explosions" by Holly Winter, who is a local composer to here. Holly is from Halifax, but lives in Newfoundland, just a couple provinces further east. And Holly is a young up-and-coming composer. I think they just finished their masters. And this piece is for small ensembles, so I think there's 7 of us playing, if I remember right. But it comes with a full soundtrack and a video projection as well. And so the audience gets to watch the video play by, as well as hear the audio, and then have the acoustic instruments kind of blend in. But in the acoustic parts, we have vocal parts. So there's audio that's happening where Holly is speaking, but then there's audio where we're yelling things, adding to the texture acoustically. But this is with the alkali group. Yeah, so I'm playing clarinet.
Okay, brilliant. Well, let's take a listen.
These hands. Look right. Look left. These hands. Before they came, the air was calm enough, coming and going, breath by breath. I grew alone. Had nothing to do. Had nothing to do. A cut paper shadow. 282. I am nobody. 8,202. You bring me sleep. 636 and the water runs over my head. 1.29 million, 8,914. 58,240, 167. 38,405. Nothing to do. 113,100. Tasteless, so big, it teases. 268. 'I have no wit, no words, no tears. how snowed in. They tend to it as water tends to the pebbles it must run over. Smoothing them gently. Hope is a thing with feathers that perches in the soul and sings the tune without the words and never stops at all. I've heard it on the chillest land and on the strangest sea. I will wear it on my heart. It opens and closes its bowl of red blooms out of sheer love of me. The water I taste is warm and soft, like the sea.
Yeah, so that was Explosions by Holly Winter. I love this piece, and I think also one of the things you mentioned was the fact that you've got all these things going on. You've got the graphical score, you've got the sort of the images, you've got the different voices, you've got people shouting and this kind of thing. How difficult was it to get all that together? I mean, it's a synchronization issue with films and videos and this kind of thing.
Quite in the sense that it's also timed. Obviously, because the video is a finite thing, and so our parts are also timed. But it's also a graphic score, so there's no pitch written, and so the score is being played on the screen behind us, but we have it in front of us too. But it's color based, and so Holly has written this score where certain colors have different meanings, and so you follow a line track on the page physically. Like the higher voice parts are at the top of the page, the lower voice parts are at the bottom, and sometimes there's little squiggles, sometimes there's little dots or words or text, but it's all on colored paper. The score itself is actually very beautiful. Like it's a piece of art into itself. It's not like when I say that the score is colorful, I don't mean it's on a piece of red construction paper and then blue.
It is very colorful. Yeah, it is. It's actually fantastic. Yeah,
it's like a beautiful gradient of colors, and it's very highly designed. So it is really hard to coordinate where everything goes, and also, as you heard, there's a point where everything cuts, which this is one of those like behind the scenes music things. Like when it goes well, you don't even think that would be a difficult thing, but to be able to do that well and to have that actual cut happen all together is incredibly difficult to time and coordinate. And so we had many rehearsals where we just did the 10 seconds leading up to that over and over and over. And so that we could hear where the cut had to happen. Because if you overplay it, the cut really doesn't have an effect.
It's not a cut. I mean, I think that was one of the great things is that it is, you got it right in this one. The timing was great. And I mean, it just is such a sudden cut that I think that's the strength of it. Obviously, if any one person overruns, it's just not going to work. Yeah,
it really takes the wind out of the sails, but it went well. We had done this piece once before in another hall, in a much smaller hall from this recording, and it was a lot easier to do because you could hear the audio track a lot better. When we're sitting on this stage, which is a much larger stage, it was just difficult to hear, and of course the projection is behind us, video, so you can't actually see either, and so you're really relying on your stopwatch and listening.
I mean, honestly, I got to ask this: did you really time it with a stopwatch? Did you really have? I mean, I'm just kind of curious. Yeah. Okay.
Yeah.
All right.
So we have a
I thought it was all
system.
done by ear. I thought you were all just, you just were so synced up together.
Well, I mean, there's certain points where you're listening for sure, but I think the piece is 5 minutes, maybe it's exactly 5 minutes or something like that. But each section is 30 seconds, and so there's no way to like internally count 30 seconds while you're playing. So we have a system where we all breathe together and start our stopwatch at the same time, and then we play.
Oh, I see little tricks. See, this is the kind of thing that I think is really interesting to talk to somebody who plays in a small group like this, because for people outside, we have no idea how you do some of these things, and kind of I think we always feel it's some sort of like brain wave synchronization thing, but it's good that there's a stopwatch. I kind of feel a bit cheated, but it's kind of nice. I mean.
I mean, sometimes it is, but often it's actually it's the most mundane answer to it. It's usually a stopwatch. And sometimes we've actually had a group stopwatch, as in someone puts a laptop in front of us and there's one person controlling it. We all just look at the same thing. But then you have to have somebody do that. It's usually easier just to have your phone on your stand and...
Now, with this particular piece, I mean, I know with a lot of these graphical scores, there's like instruction about how much, sort of your deviation ability from the score. So for this particular piece, how much freedom did you have in terms of your pitch or timing and this kind of thing?
Not as much as you might think. It's pretty prescribed. So Holly was pretty clear about certain colors meaning, like for my part, like growls and multiphonics and like gross sounds, or it being like high whistle tone, really breathy high whistle. Like it's pretty prescribed. But normally in graphic score world, it really is just whatever that looks feels like to you. You can make that sound, but this one is actually pretty well defined.
I'm going to have to ask you what's a growl on a clarinet? I mean, what does that sound like? I mean, is it?
Yeah,
a growl?
So there's I mean, there's kind of two different ways to make it. You can either flutter tongue, Flatzozong, and you roll your tongue like a rolled R into the clarinet as you make a pitch, and so the air fluctuates at that really fast time, and so it comes out like a growl. But that is technically fairly difficult to do, and also some people can't genetically flutter their tongue. And so the workaround is you can do it with the back of the tongue as well and do it that way, or you can't do either of those. If you sing the same pitch that you're playing, it will interfere with the pitch and you get
that's nice.
Same thing.
By the way, I'm here busy trying to flutter the front of my tongue now. Luckily, nobody can see this. No, I can't even think how to do it. I can't even think how it. No.
If you do can you roll your R's? There it is.
Oh, okay. All right. That's hey. Yeah. Okay. All right. We learned so many things on this show. I can now flutter tongue a clarinet. Well, there you go. Yeah. So that was the graphical score. So really fantastic. And you said there's a lot of vocal inputs and outputs in there as well. I mean, there's a lot of vocal things going on as well. So kind of a really nice piece. The next piece we're going to hear is again by the Alkali Group. And this is Missy Mazzoli, who I love Missy Mazzoli's music, I must admit, already. So we're already pushing on an open door here. I've played some of the music on the radio show. And this is called Still Life with Avalanche. So do you say a few words about that before we listen to it?
Yeah, so this is Missy Mazzoli's. piece, and I did include it because I know you like Oli.
Oh, thank you.
And so I also really love this piece. I mean, we worked very hard on this piece. It's a very difficult one to get put together. When you listen to Missy Mazzoli's work, it's again deceiving in it doesn't sound terribly difficult,
Mm-hmm.
but it is actually very, very, very difficult to play. There are very complex time changes, meter changes, and things are shifting. There's a lot of really nebulous time that sounds like it's free and floaty, but it's actually incredibly precise and counted, even though it sounds like it's all just kind of floating. So when you listen to it, there's this opening bit at the very start with a bunch of harmonicas, and people are playing what sounds like very just slowly shifting. It might be a graphic score harmonica parts, but it's actually underneath. But it sounds like just like a chord that's kind of floating. But that's a hallmark of Missy Mazzoli, that it actually is very, very complex in its construction, but sounds just kind of fun and light. But this is Missy Mazzoli's Still Life with Avalanche.
Yeah, let's take a listen. Okay, so that was the Mizzy Mazzoli piece, "Still Life with Avalanche." One of the things I found, as you say, it sounds very simple. I mean, not very. It sounds simple in its context, but it's very difficult. It sounds to me, and I mean, this is not maybe very scientific, but there were a lot of different melodies in this, all kind of like, I guess I would say tripping over. It sounded like, you'd have one and then another one and then another, and it would always be stutter starting and this kind of thing. Um, First of all, is that true? Because it
Oh
sounds
yeah,
like
very
that.
much so. Yeah.
I mean, you've already mentioned it's difficult to play that kind of thing. But from your point of view, as you were clarinetist again in this, how do you deal with this kind of complexity? I mean, uh, is it just like, hey, I just have to learn it? I mean, I'm sure you do, but I mean, what are the difficulties about this particular type of music?
You really second guess yourself, and you really think that, oh, my line should line up with maybe the flute, and it doesn't, and you have to trust that it doesn't, and know that
Mm.
you are counting correctly, you are doing the right thing. It feels like maybe you started too early, or you should have started later, but you didn't. But you have to really trust yourself that it will line up, and it is supposed to be two things kind of happening at the same time that sound like they kind of clash, or they're two different melodies that are overlap. Um, and that maybe is the hardest thing. That there's a few moments where there's a lot of rests happening, people, and you have to come in together with somebody else from basically nothing,
Mm.
doing something that's really different from what's already happening, and you have to trust that you're all counting correctly, and that when you do it, you will do it together, and that it's fine. But there's a lot of people who play chamber music. This is why they play chamber music. There's a lot of interconnection and looking at each other and trying to connect and hear and do visual cues and audio cues and things. And that's true of any chamber music. I mean, if you're playing Haydn, you do that. If you're playing Mozart, you do that. But when you're playing this type of stuff, you're looking desperately at the violinist to just give me some affirmative that I think I know where I am, and you think you know where I am, and that yes, that is correct. We're both there together.
And the
And
poor
so,
violinist is lost completely, probably.
yeah, and they're looking at you for the same thing, and you just and then you look over at the flautist, and they confirm that you're both correct, and we move together. Like that's kind of what it is, but it feels very. Um, you're holding on by a rope kind of at all times, but
Mm.
that's kind of the fun of it.
I guess so, because I would assume in a big orchestra, you obviously got the conductor who's doing
Mm-hmm.
everything. But here you're sort of, you're on your own, as it were, and you're trying to interact with a number of people.
Yeah.
One of the things you said there raised an interesting issue about the way we see maybe music and patterns, in the sense that, it is kind of difficult if you want to offset yourself from something, if you know what I mean. It's like to be out of step with something. Because I think, from my perspective, the brain always looks for a pattern and tries to sort of match the pattern. So that, I guess, is quite a
Yeah.
deliberate kind of forcing of yourself to go, no, hold on, I've got to be a fraction late here.
And there's some really great examples of it. I mean, it's certainly not necessarily a new thing, um, but there's some really great composers that are probably more at-home names. But
Mm.
um, Percy Granger has some moments
Mm. Yes.
of everything is just two people are playing, but they're offset by an eighth note, and it feels uncomfortable, and it's supposed to feel uncomfortable, but they're doing the same melody, just
Mm.
slightly off step. There's maybe less known, but Charles Ives, who's an American
Oh, yeah.
composer, who all of his music just sounds like he took 2 bars of this, 5 bars of this, 1 bar of that, 7 bars of that, and just put it all on the same page on top of each other. And it really sounds chaotic and um, very, very dense.
Mm.
But that's just the way it's supposed to be. It just sounds really
Mm.
overlapped.
I mean, I guess this is, again, a non-musical person here. I mean, sometimes if you, I don't know if it's right or not, but sometimes when you get music that is too precise, it sounds formulaic.
Mm.
If it's slightly different, then it sounds like human. And then if it's slightly too much, it sounds this sort of you're now into the regime you've just said.
Yeah.
So I guess I guess I find this fascinating. There's this slight timing thing that can send it between chaos and computerized sounding to human and it's all within a fraction of a beat, you know.
We more and more we talk about this in recording world of when you listen to modern recordings, they're so highly processed and they're so incredibly well rehearsed that they don't sound real and they don't sound human. And it's not that it's not a feat of musicality to sound that incredibly blended and the trumpet line perfectly is balanced and that all of the cellos come in at the exact same time and that, violin line is very precise and every single one of those 20 violinists are playing it exactly the same. It's impressive, but it does sound cleanly. It's too precise, and so that's why I think we love old recordings of things probably for a reason. There's a little bit of dirt on it that's much better.
Yeah, it's kind of, I guess what I lo-fi approach to some of this. You're actually blurring it a little bit, and you're not being quite perfect, and it gives it that sort of more, I'd use the word organic feel to the way.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think there's a non-classical. Well, actually, I shouldn't say that. He's actually writing a lot more classical music lately. But Sufjan Stevens, I don't know if you encountered Sufjan. He's mostly a singer-songwriter. He'll never listen to this, so I'll say presumed queer, but not actually verifiably queer. But his music is extremely queer. And the beautiful thing about Sufjan Stevens' music, and he writes kind of everything from like actual pop songs to choral music, and he just released an album of solo piano music and piano duets that are they're as classical as you can get. They're like compositions in the fullest sense. But there's the two albums that I really, really love. He did 2 albums of Christmas music, and I love Christmas music in general, but he did really interesting takes on Christmas music, and he's such an interesting composer and musician that he would take O Come, O Come Emmanuel and do 7 versions of it, 7 arrangements on one album.
Wow.
Different voicings, different instruments, different tempos, different everything. And there's one of the songs that he kind of reworked a number of times. It's an old hymn, Ah Holy Jesus, which I think is Lutheran in terms of where it comes from. And there's a beautiful recording of it where it's clearly just him and 3 or 4 friends sitting on a microphone, and nothing lines up. It's everybody is kind of sight reading their part, and it's not an arrangement. It's literally just the hymn as it is in the hymnal, but it's not precise. Everybody kind of breathes at different times and comes in at a different time, and the soprano is like a beat behind for a while. It's beautiful. It really just opens everything up into this very different space than if it had been just precisely moving together. But I think that's a really wonderful thing that we don't allow ourselves as musicians to do a whole lot, and it feels wrong a lot of the time, but it's much more interesting.
We could always ask the question whether Mozart would have liked it, I guess. And I always kind of feel these people would have said, okay, try it, see what it sounds like,
I would think they would. You can't place words into a dead composer's mouth, I suppose, but they liked sound and they liked music and they liked innovation. What innovation was for them was different than what we may say it is now, but they liked new sounds. They were composers.
It was, yeah. Well, we got one more piece to listen to, and that is by Anne Southam, called Network. Tell us about this one. And is this the Alkali group as well?
This is also Alkali, yeah. So one of the caveats of being a university conductor is you can't share any of the recordings because they're students and there's copyrights and blah, blah, blah,
Yeah.
blah. So unfortunately, I couldn't share any of my actual students' work, although they play lovely in a lot of things. But
They do.
this is the Alkali
Let me
group.
just say before you say this, I did watch some of the ones that you kindly sent me, which we can't play, and I have to say there were two brilliant pieces in it. That one, it was this one called New Cosmology. We'll talk briefly about this because I'm sure we can talk about it. One was called New Cosmologies, I think it was. I don't know who wrote it. I couldn't pick that up from the thingy, but it was fantastic, and I loved it. It was the one with the ripping paper and people stomping around, doing all that, and it was just great. And I think that was fantastic. But as you rightly predicted, I love is it Frederick Shevsky?
Yeah,
Shevsky
Shevsky.
bit coming together. And I have to say, I absolutely adored that, and I think you knew that when you sent it to me. But it was absolutely brilliant. Maybe you'd just like to say a brief word about that before we go back to Anne Southam about the Shevsky.
Totally. Yeah, so the Frederick Shevsky is coming together, and we did it with my full university ensemble and the Alkali ensemble, so there were 30-odd people on stage. And it's 20-something minutes long. The score is 20-something pages long, and everybody plays from the exact same thing. And it's a tone row, so it's a 6-note pattern that gets repeated over and over and over and over and over again in different iterations. And the whole thing is a palindrome. So the 22 pages, there's a middle point at page 11 where it splits and then it goes in reverse. And the tone row gets re-put together. So over the first 11 pages, the tone row gets devolved and spread out. And then over the following 11 pages, it gets kind of reconfigured and put back together. The text is from an inmate at the Attica prison. And so during the riots at the Attica prison, this man who was actually, he kind of found himself at the Attica prison. This is as strange a story as you can think, but he was involved in the apartheid riots in South Africa and was incarcerated in South Africa and then was transferred somehow because he was an American citizen to Attica. And so he then found himself at the riots in Attica, and he wrote these poems that he would send to a magazine to be published. And so the text from this piece is taken from the writings of this poet. And so the speaker speaks over the orchestra, and there's a poetry element to the whole thing. But it's an endurance piece. It's very difficult to keep together and keep playing. We had done this once with Alkali just by ourselves, and it took us, 3 or 4 rehearsals to be able to play it together. To be able to play it with 30-something musicians took many more rehearsals. Just get everybody at the same place at the same time. It's one of those things that if it goes off the rails, there's no way to come back. There is no way to signal where you are. And so you just have to hope that you keep it together. We had never played it all the way through until this performance because we have very tight timelines. And so the students had played it through, Alkali had played it through. We had never played it through together until on stage at the concert. And there's a moment, it's about 7 minutes in, where it really probably could have all come apart. It didn't. We managed to continue the next 15 or so minutes. But I would encourage everybody to listen to, there's a really phenomenal recording, because I can't play this one. Too bad, but that's okay. There's a really phenomenal recording by an ensemble called Eighth Blackbird. And Eighth Blackbird is an American group, and they do very similar music to what we play with Alkali. They do a lot of new music, a lot of graphic scores, a lot of new commissions. And they do a really phenomenal recording of Frederick Rzewski's Coming Together. That is a lot of fun. It's a very overwhelming work. It
Yeah.
feels very full body. And I can say I've listened to it as an audience person, and it feels oppressive and like it's never going to end, and it feels overwhelming and very uncomfortable. The text is kind of difficult at points, and it's like maybe listening to Philip Glass. Like you have to really allow your brain to just sit with it, even though it's hard at times. But I can say as a musician who's played it as a clarinetist and then as a conductor who's conducted it, it's equally as difficult just to stay in the space with it. So go listen to Eighth Blackbird because they do a wonderful recording.
That sounds good. Yeah. I mean, I found the tension in it to be phenomenal. I mean, it kind of just builds all the way through the piece, and it never stops. It's just kind of relentless. And I guess if you like somebody like Giorgio Ligeti or Steve Reich, you're going to like this kind of incessant piece that keeps on at you all the time.
And it is incessant, and it every time you turn a page as a player or as a conductor, you think, "Oh my God! Like there's still 10 more pages or 9 more pages," and you feel like that page took what felt like 10 minutes to get through, and then you turn the page and there's still another 10. Feels really relentless, but obviously, I mean that's the effect of being in prison.
And the students, I must say, did a fantastic job. So and the conductor was brilliant, I must say. So anyway, let's go back to that. Was fantastic. Yes. Great advert for that. It really was good and worth seeing, certainly. Let's go back to Anne Southam, Network.
So Anne Southam is a Canadian composer who passed away a number of years ago, and she was kind of one of our Canadiana composers. She wrote a ton of music, really phenomenal music, actually kind of in a similar style to Glass and to Reich and Ligeti and a number of people, but she was famous for a set of pieces called Glass Houses, which are really beautiful. They're pieces for piano, and many times marimbas will do them. They kind of transfer well too. But this piece is a piece called Networks, and it's maybe as the title implies, it's a set of notes on a page, and 2 people get to play at a time, and you predetermine the order, and so you just kind of randomly pick that it will be say flute and violin, and then violin and flute, and then flute and percussion, and then percussion and saxophone and clarinet. There always has to be one person that carries over into the next duet. It's also timed, so everything is in 30-second intervals, and then there's a switch, and so each person will play for 1 minute at a time because they play in each duet. And then they take a break. And so everybody plays for a minute at a time with 1 minute overlapping. And the only other instructions that are given are pitches. So Anne sets out a number of pitches, and they're just in little square boxes that you read. And the only other thing she says other than pitches is if you are playing a sustained note or a rhythm. And it doesn't prescribe what either is. But if the box has a line under it, you play a rhythm. If it has a capital letter, you play a sustained note. And that's really it. And so you really listen to your duet partner, and you really play off what they're doing. And so maybe like we were talking about the Holly Winter, that the Winter was much, much more prescribed. There was a lot more boundaries and guidelines to work within. This is very few. And so you have to interact with your musician in a lot more real way.
Fantastic. Well, let's take a listen. Okay, great. Well, that was Networks by Anne Southam. Just to say that one of the things you mentioned about it was about how she wrote sort of music of the area, I guess. And as soon as I heard this, I had the feeling that I was in some northern clime, in some cold, place. I mean, it really does have that feeling to it. And I don't know quite how she does it, but it's certainly, you certainly feel you want to sort of, wrap up and go out in the storm kind of thing.
There's a feeling often in Canadian composers of expanse, I would say. Like there's a real feeling of how large this country is, and I don't know how we do that. I don't know how we convey that, but like there is a feeling in a lot of Canadian music of the kind of global north, the like wide open. We don't have. I mean, where I live, we don't have tundra, but like in Canada, we have tundra. Like it feels very, both bundle up, but wide.
Yeah. And I mean, the airiness and this sort of openness to it. Yeah, it does. It's like kind of prairie or something, or, what you say, tundra and this kind of thing. Yeah, very interesting. Very interesting. Well, we're coming towards the end of the show, but I do have a one other question I have to ask before we go, because we it's the one we always have to address. Okay. And I think it's only fair that you should answer this as well. So, coming from the queer community, how does being queer affect your music?
I think about this a lot, obviously. I tend to think that being a queer musician sets you up to both have different expectations about what can happen and should happen and does happen, but gives you many, many more things to draw on. And I think where, for me as a conductor and as a musicologist, that comes out is in performance programming, repertoire, things like that, that I tend to have a different set of things that I'm drawing on. I tend to have a different set of repertoire, interests, crossovers, multidisciplinary things that I incorporate into what I'm doing. I also tend to think that, increasingly in the work that I do with university students, we have a very high queer population in music schools. That's not terribly new, but I think there is a much more immediate rapport that you get as a queer conductor with your queer musicians. That just, it's an immediate trust, an immediate feeling of being safe in that space that allows them to play. And even when you're playing something that's really not queer, like maybe Holst, which is beautiful music, but I've sat in a lot of orchestras and wind ensembles as a musician where the conductor was a mid-50s straight white guy who had zero things in common with me or the other queer people around, and I didn't want to play for him. It was really difficult sometimes to be expressive or to make a beautiful sound or to feel like I could play without being judged harshly, or that the sound I was going to create was going to be interpreted a different way than I wanted it to be or something. But the number of times where I've played for queer conductors or as a queer conductor and I get to work with musicians who are queer, it just feels more open and relaxed and really much more comfortable and safe. I had the pleasure every now and again, we don't run it regularly at the moment, but I do a queer ensemble, the Halifax Queer Ensemble. And before the pandemic, we used to have weekly rehearsals, but we just did our first rehearsal post-pandemic. We did a one-day thing, and it was small, and it was really ragtag group of musicians. Some people were professionals, some hadn't played in 15 years, some kind of played their instrument, but really were not professionals in any way, shape, or form. But we immediately got to make good music together. There was no adjustment period. There was no posturing. There was no weird feeling of hierarchy. There was no oddness around being visibly and verbally queer in that space, that people could just sit down and make sound together and make music, and we laughed and it was fun, and we did harder music than they were comfortable playing, and we did easier music, but none of that really mattered. It was just about being in that space together. And there's a really, for me, both in my work as a queer person conducting non-queer things, or as a queer person conducting very queer things, there's a really powerful feeling of queering that space, whatever that space is. It's important to me to be a university conductor and temporarily queer that concert hall. That feels really important. If it's important for the 7 people who think it's important, great. That's enough. That's fine for me. It doesn't need to be super important for the entire audience or the entire ensemble, but even if it's just important for the few kids in the ensemble and their friends in the audience, that's it. That's all I really am concerned about. We did a show 6 years ago, I guess 7 years ago, where we went to another city. We brought the ensemble, and we were working with a trans poet who wrote a bunch of poetry for the show. And we worked with a high school group. So we were the university group when we came in, and we got to work with this high school group. The high school group was huge. It was like a band of 80 kids. We were small. We were like 25. And we had this wonderful poet join us, and we did the show. It was fun. It was great. And then afterwards, this group of 6 or 7 queer high schoolers came up and said, we've never worked with a queer musician before. That was phenomenal. We've never played a queer composer before. That was phenomenal. And we've never met a trans poet before. And that was phenomenal. And even for those 7 kids, that's all I care about. That's it. That means so much to me, that they got to see themselves represented on stage. That's it.
I think that's a great line to finish with. I'm sure we could analyze all of that for a long time, but I think that really sums up, I think, for a lot of us, how we feel about, in all our walks of life, about being queer and how we affect the space around. So I think that's a great way to leave, Jacob. Thank you so much for your time. For the listeners, normal service will be resumed next month, when we will have another guest. Trust me, Jacob is never interviewing me about music. So thank you again, Jacob.
Oh, my pleasure. It was so much fun to, it's always fun to get to guests, but it was fun to just talk with us. It was great.
Yeah, sounds good. Anyway, thanks everyone. Bye. So that's all for this episode. You've been listening to the Classical Queer Podcast, and Jacob and I look forward to being with you next month. The incidental music is courtesy of Jared Miller, and the show was produced by Samantha Jane.